Hello, friends, and welcome to Home is Where the Body Is. I'm Jen, an ADHD woman with EDS, POTS, complex PTSD, and OCD, shaped by an abusive religious upbringing. I spent much of my life feeling like I was balancing precariously over an endless pit, constantly reaching for a stable home that always seemed just out of reach. Today, I can honestly say that home is wherever I am right now, built on the stable ground that's growing out of a deepening relationship with my body and myself. In this podcast, I share the lived experiences that brought me here in case it helps someone feel less alone or supports them on their own journey home. Today's topic is mental health and the mental health system. I spent years being a patient, years letting the mental health system look inside my brain for something broken, a chemical imbalance, a faulty thought pattern, something it could point to and say, there's the problem. And every time the SSRIs didn't work, and the CBT felt like being gaslit with a clipboard, I assumed the failure was mine. It wasn't, though. The framework was. Right before I understood the details of my neurotype and trauma, before I knew I was ADHD and had CPTSD and OCD, I spent years as a patient diagnosed with clinical depression and generalized anxiety disorder. I spent years in the mental health field attempting to fix whatever chemical imbalance was running amok in my brain or to alter whatever incorrect thinking process was poisoning me from the inside out, supposedly. But the endless SSRIs gave me only side effects. CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, felt like gaslighting myself when society was already doing that well enough for me. And advice to just get out there felt incredibly counterproductive when out there was where all the problems seemed to start in the first place. And I know this is not a unique experience. I know there are a lot of other neurodivergent people, autistic people, women, autistic women, I think in particular, out there who have this experience of being given the runaround by the mental health system, being given advice for depression when it's actually autistic burnout, etc. So hopefully this resonates with somebody because I think even within a system, I've talked about the overall health system before in a previous episode, and I just think that there are a lot of systems out there that are even supposed to be, quote, finding what's, quote, wrong and helping us, but oftentimes they end up kind of just making us think we're even more wrong because we can't even be helped by the thing that's supposed to help us. So, like, my problem with this experience is that there was a pattern of mental health providers assuming a simple chemical imbalance or random occurrence of maladaptive thinking patterns could explain every mental health issue. And I think that the pharmaceutical industry has a role in shaping these types of diagnostic frameworks. Like, I don't know much about how the mental health field has evolved over time, but I know that most of the time that I've been in it, there has been this huge push towards SSRIs. And of course, I'm not shitting on SSRIs. I know that they help a lot of people, and I absolutely think that they should remain accessible to the people who they help. Um, but I think it's also important to keep in mind that the pharmaceutical companies that make SSRIs have a financial incentive to push them as much as possible. And so, what I'm trying to say, I'm not necessarily trying to call out SSRIs specifically, it's just something that I've had a lot of experience with where the answer was always just, try another SSRI. But the point is, when the dominant treatment model is built around selling a product, the incentive is always to locate the problem inside the patient rather than the world they're living in. Right? Because if the problem is, oh, you're an autistic person living in an allistic world, then the pharmaceutical companies can't sell you SSRIs. I mean, unless they genuinely do help you. Um, but I think, the real answer is change society. Give you SSRIs in the meantime if you need them and if they help you. But don't gaslight the people who they don't help into thinking that, their environment isn't part of the problem because their environment is part of the problem. Being an autistic person in an allistic society is part of the problem. Being in difficult financial situations, difficult relational situations is part of the problem. Anyway, I hope that this makes some kind of sense. I'm just trying to point out that I think the mental health field has focused a lot on things like SSRIs and CBT, which I know is very helpful to a lot of people, but for some reason it was just like it has been like the treatment for a long time. And I wish that the mental health field would, emphasize other treatment options, consider other possibilities. Like maybe you're multiply neurodivergent and you don't know it. Or maybe you just live in a fucked up capitalist society. Or maybe you have unaddressed childhood trauma. Maybe complex PTSD is part of it. But I think often, or at least in my case, I just got labeled anxious and depressed and just got SSRIs, CBT, and just standard, like, get out there, work on your anxiety type of advice, which just like never helped. And instead of being like, why isn't this helping? And instead of acknowledging my environment as part of the problem, it was just like, oh, well, the right SSRI is out there somewhere. The right way to approach CBT, we'll find it someday, and that sort of thing. And so I classify CBT as like a fix your thinking type of approach, but I think those can erase environmental context entirely because CBT asks you to examine whether your thoughts are rational, but it rarely asks whether the situation producing those thoughts is rational. Like for people whose anxiety is rooted in actual ongoing harm, being coached to reframe your thinking isn't therapy. It's just a more sophisticated form of being told you're overreacting. So, like, I think a lot of autistic people feel gaslit by CBT, myself included, because it labels your reactions to the holistic world as irrational. But they're not irrational. Like, I went through life feeling like the universe was out to get me, and everybody was always telling me how irrational that was. But when you think about it from an autistic point of view, it's actually very rational. Like, people are more likely to dislike autistic people. Social interactions with allistic people very often go wrong when you're autistic. So, to call that irrational, it that like really was dismissive of my lived experience. And so again, I also don't necessarily want to shit on CBT either because I know that it does help a lot of people. But I think the point is we need to take into account other factors or the environment, how the environment is treating this person, how the environment reacts to this person, rather than just being like, okay, it's either a chemical imbalance or some sort of faulty thinking, whatever. And maybe I'm simplifying the mental health field. I don't know. I'd be interested to know if other people had different experiences. But this was very much my experience with the mental health field and also that of some of my friends, my late diagnosed autistic women friends. But there is like a specific exhaustion, I think, of trying modalities that weren't built for your nervous system or circumstances over and over again. Right? Like you're given depression advice for autistic burnout, and depression advice is basically to like go go out there and go do a lot of things and like stimulate your nervous system. Whereas autistic burnout is like you need to give your nervous system a break. So it's like not even is it just that the treatment modality isn't working, but it also could potentially be worsening things and exhausting you further. And there's like a specific exhaustion there, right? Where you're doing all the quote right things, the therapy, the medication, the worksheets, and you're still not getting better. It doesn't just leave you back where you started, it leaves you back where you started, but also now more exhausted. And if you don't have amazing health insurance, probably also out of a lot of money or even in debt. I know that I have spent so much money on um, in the mental health field over the years. I even did this like DNA test where they swab the inside of your mouth and they like test your DNA um, to see like which SSRI you're most likely to respond to or least likely to have side effects to. I did that. I tried them all. I still had side effects. Although I do think part of that is that I think sometimes neurodivergent people, there is some evidence that we might need lower doses than standard. So it could just have been that. But I suppose I'll never know because I'm not really interested in trying out SSRIs again because of my bad experience. But anyway, the cruelest part of being handed a diagnosis that doesn't fit is that you spend years trying to fix the wrong thing. Every tool that doesn't work becomes more evidence that you're uniquely unfixable, when really you were just being handed the wrong map. And the people drawing the map had every financial incentive to keep drawing it the same way. Here's what actually changed everything for me. Learning that my coping mechanisms weren't malfunctions, they were solutions. Smart, desperate, perfectly rational solutions to things that were actually happening to me. The brain doesn't glitch, it adapts. And sometimes what looks like a disorder is just adaptation that outlived the emergency. As now is understood in the field of trauma recovery, these mental and emotional coping mechanisms and states serve a purpose when they first arise, and then only later when the danger has passed and we're attempting to thrive rather than simply desperately hold on to an uncertain survival, do the trauma patterns become maladaptive. And I, but I think that this can be expanded beyond trauma to a degree. Like, I think sometimes depression or anxiety is a logical response to the terrible situation that someone is in, you know? And so I think that, I don't know, I just think that the person is always labeled as, um, you have clinical depression, you have generalized anxiety disorder. And maybe some people, like, legitimately do without, like maybe some people are in a genuinely good situation and still are depressed and anxious. And I, of course, don't want to dismiss those people. But I think it's also important to keep in mind that, again, sometimes anxiety, depression, etc., just like trauma, are, or just like trauma responses or coping mechanisms, are rational responses to the environment you are in now or the environment you were in before. And maybe instead of just labeling everyone as, you're pathologically depressed or pathologically anxious. Maybe we should start labeling like capitalism. Maybe we should just start saying capitalism is toxic and depression is a rational response to it. And I don't say that to say that, oh, we should stop trying to treat depression or anything, but rather to say maybe we should try to dismantle capitalism and then maybe people will be less depressed. Anyway, I hope that makes some sort of sense. The key realization for me was that none of this was random, none of it was my fault, and none of it would be healed or fixed simply by willing myself to be a happier, less anxious, or more well adjusted person. And I still contend that there may be no such thing as a random chemical imbalance in the human brain. I think in a lot of cases, the environment is to blame, not the brain chemistry. Or maybe I should say the brain chemistry is responding rationally, adaptively to the environment. Although, take my theory with a grain of salt, I am not a professional in any of these fields. I am not a neuroscientist or a neurologist or whatever profession studies brain chemistry. Um, and of course, not to invalidate people for whom the mainstream treatment modalities like SSRIs and CBT is helpful for, but rather just to motivate an alternative perspective when those things don't work. And also to maybe expand the mental health field to include like part of improving societal mental health is, I don't know, instituting a universal basic income and universal health care and those sorts of things can be considered beneficial to mental health. And so maybe the mental health field should like get involved in those things. Of course, I say this as someone who is not in the mental health field. Um, so I don't know. I guess take that with a grain of salt as well. But I have been a patient in the mental health field for a very long time. So the nervous system is a record keeper, not a malfunctioning machine, is I guess another way to try to phrase what I'm trying to say. And I think this is currently recognized in trauma fields, but not necessarily in like the anxiety and depression realm. And like in my case, my trauma was not labeled as such. Again, I was just labeled as anxious and depressed. And so I don't know. Sometimes I guess trauma gets overlooked. And like depression for example, avoids expanding energy on a fight you can't win. So that's adaptive in certain situations, and anxiety keeps you pointed at survival. So that's also adaptive in certain situations. And so I think it's more of a question of how do we get people out of environments where depression and anxiety are adaptive and are rational responses, because those must be very shitty environments. Anyway, I think there is a lot of grief and anger in realizing how much time has been spent, for me, how much time was spent trying to fix the wrong thing. I think that's also true of some of my friends as well and other autistic people I've talked to. Just a lot of grief and anger in trying to, quote, fix anxiety, depression, bipolar, narcissistic personality disorder, all of these things, and then realizing, oh, that was not the answer at all along, and no wonder nothing I did worked. Calling it a chemical imbalance makes it sound like a manufacturing defect, like you came out of the factory wrong. But what if your brain came out exactly right and just got very, very good at surviving something it shouldn't have had to survive? And what if the problem was never your adaptation, but the environment you had to and are still having to adapt to, and survive in. There's a question the mental health system almost never asks, and it's the only one that ever helped me. Not what's wrong with your brain, but what happened to you or is happening to you, and what did your brain have to do or still has to do to get through it? That shift isn't just semantic, it's the difference between shame and understanding, between being a passive patient or an active witness to and participant in your own story. Like, of course, people are going to be depressed and anxious while living in a capitalist hellscape that values them only for how much they can be exploited for their labor. Of course, women are going to be hypervigilant and stressed out when half the population has a documented record of committing violence against them. Of course, disabled people are going to feel bitter and broken when they are consistently kept out of the very career that once felt meaningful to them simply because they require a few accommodations. And of course, traumatized autistic people are going to struggle to heal trauma using the standard methods when the holistic world is consistently re traumatizing them. So I think it's time we stop asking what is wrong with this person's brain and what's wrong with their thinking, and start asking what is wrong with this person's environment and the way they are being treated. And what it means to locate the problem structurally rather than personally is that it shifts some of the responsibility. And it can be really disorienting after years of internalizing, like, oh, there's something very wrong with me, there's something uniquely wrong with me. It can be really disorienting when you spent years believing the problem is you. uh, Finding out that the problem is the system can feel almost too good to be true, like you're just making excuses. But there's a difference between accountability and self blame, and most of us were never taught that difference. The difference is like accountability is I have trauma responses that are very rational, based on how I grew up, but I won't allow others to be hurt because of my trauma responses. Like, taking accountability is recognizing it doesn't give me an excuse to just lash out at others. And, but that's different than self blame, which would be like, oh my god, I'm so horrible. Like, the fact that I even get triggered at all is bad and my fault. And so those are like two different things, and I know I was never taught that difference growing up, and I think a lot of people aren't. Locating harm accurately isn't letting yourself off the hook, it's finally putting the system on the hook alongside you, if that makes sense. That's a weird kind of metaphor. But it's like it can still be your personal responsibility to heal, to try to change your environment to the best of your abilities, to try to find supportive people to, you know, survive this capitalist hellscape alongside. But I think it helps to not see it just as, oh, there's something wrong with me, or even not even just see it as, oh, I'm an autistic person. Of course, I'm going to struggle in these ways, but to also see it as like, but a holistic society is also making me struggle more than if I were just an autistic person existing in a vacuum or existing in a group of other autistic people. And yeah. Anyway, so I think it's time that we pathologize the system rather than just pathologizing the person. For mental health specifically, I think. Um, and there's the particular experience of being neurodivergent in a world designed to exhaust you, and then being told that exhaustion is a disorder. Autistic people, ADHDers, and other neurodivergent folks are often living at a constant deficit, we're masking, translating, managing a world that was built without us in mind, and then sitting across from a clinician who wants to know why our nervous system is so dysregulated. The dysregulation is the correct response to the conditions. The disorder is being expected to function as if those conditions don't exist. Right? That would be the true disordered part. If an autistic person could just like walk around a holistic society and not be exhausted, that's abnormal, you know? I just think when you finally understand the problem is your environment and not you, you can finally take whatever small steps you can to change or emotionally detach yourself from your environment. Which is, of course, not always completely possible. We can't, I mean, I'm too disabled to just nope out and go into the wilderness. Um, so I have to exist within capitalism and patriarchy and everything. But the point of a lot of my episodes is to explore what we sometimes can do, even just internally, in order to protect and build sanctuaries for ourselves. And of course, I just want to reiterate that I don't want to dismiss anybody who thinks that, they do genuinely have a chemical imbalance in their brain, or they think that they are in a good situation and just feel depressed or anxious or whatever for no reason. I don't want to dismiss those people at all. But want to I just want to encourage the mental health field to examine that sometimes that might not be the case, you know? Like, I want to encourage the mental health field to take the environment into account, to take the person's identity into account. Like, is this a disabled, queer, trans, black woman in front of me? If so, she probably has a lot of things working against her that are like making her depressed or making her mental health suffer. So, anyway, in those cases, you were never the problem. You were the proof. Proof that something in the environment, in the system, was failing people like you. And I think there's something that feels a lot like relief and freedom in finally being able to say that out loud. As we come to the end of this episode, I want to thank you for spending this time with me. If something here resonated, you're always welcome to reach out or share your thoughts in the comments. And if you'd like to support this podcast, the most helpful thing you can do is subscribe on YouTube and engage with the video. Like, comment, or share it with someone who might need it. If you're listening on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, leaving a review there also really helps. You've been listening to Home is Where the Body Is. I'm Jen, and I wish you a safe journey home.